Early in July of 1982, a corrections officer made his rounds at a jail in San Jose, California. Everything seemed normal as he inspected each inmate's cell. But as the guard peered into the last cell on the row, he was startled by what he saw. The inmate was sitting on his bunk, staring forward, his mouth hanging open. He looked completely frozen, almost like something out of a wax museum. The guard gave the cell door a few loud knocks with his flashlight, but the inmate didn't move or even blink. The guard was afraid that the inmate was dead. So he unlocked the door and stepped into the cell, and he got right up next to the inmate, and when he did, he could feel breath coming from the man's open mouth. So he knew he was alive. He gently touched the inmate to try to get him to react, but he didn't, and that gentle tap made the man's whole body rock back and forth on the bunk like a rocking chair. The guy was stiff as a board. The guard had no idea what was going on, and he was feeling very freaked out. But then he noticed the inmate's eyes. They had a look of absolute terror in them. And the guard knew this man needed help right now. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, the next time you're invited over to the Follow Button's house for a sleepover, be super soothing and tuck the Follow Button into their sleeping bag and read them a story, and then right as they fall asleep, turn on Norwegian death metal at full blast. This episode is called Brain Freeze. On a warm morning in July of 1982, 42-year-old Daniel Martinez woke up in his small apartment in San Jose, California. Next to him, his girlfriend Kathy slept with her head on his shoulder. Light poured in through the window, and it made Daniel groan and he closed his eyes. He and Kathy had gotten high on heroin the night before, and now he felt way more hungover than usual. Daniel remembered that the heroin he had shot up last night burned like red-hot lava as he injected it into his vein. Within seconds, he had felt this amazing high, but along with the expected feelings of euphoria came hallucinations that left him stumbling around and bumping into things. It had also taken him a long time to come down and finally fall asleep. Daniel thought maybe that was why he was feeling so stiff that morning. As he tried to pry his arm out from under Kathy's head, his body felt super heavy. He had to pull his arm really hard, which woke Kathy up. And when Daniel told her how weird he was feeling, she said she felt stiff too. Then she pulled the covers back over her head to go back to sleep. Daniel wanted to lie back down too, but his parole officer told him if he didn't show up for his court appearance that morning, he'd be headed straight back to jail. And so, very slowly, Daniel pulled himself up and shuffled to the bathroom. An hour later, Daniel pulled into the parking lot of the county courthouse. The whole drive, Daniel had struggled just to turn the steering wheel of his old Volkswagen. Now that he was here, he knew he only had 10 minutes to register in the courtroom, so he tried to move quickly. But once he was out of his car, he could barely feel his feet as he walked towards the entrance. He felt so clumsy. It took him multiple tries just to drop his keys into the tray for the metal detector. Daniel did his best to look casual as he walked past the guard. But he stumbled as he passed by and had to grab the conveyor belt just to catch his balance. The guard looked at him suspiciously and asked Daniel if he was intoxicated. Daniel tried to explain that he was sober, but his tongue felt as numb as his feet, and so he slurred when he spoke. And so he was not surprised when the guard took his arm and told him he was under arrest for suspicion of being under the influence, which was a clear parole violation. Daniel knew he was headed to jail. Almost a week later, Daniel sat motionless on his bunk in jail, itching and burning where the weight of his body pressed into the thin mattress. For the past 6 days that he'd been in jail, Daniel had felt his body growing heavier and more rigid. It took him longer and longer to make it to the cafeteria line when it was time to eat, and even when he finally shuffled his way through the line, he dropped his tray at least once per meal. And so the guards started to bring his meals directly to his bunk, but eventually, Daniel couldn't even bend his arms to eat or drink. Finally, the guards brought him soup with a straw, but by that time, his mouth and jaws had started to lock up, and so he couldn't even eat. And on top of that, because his jaw was all locked up, he couldn't really speak. It was just a raspy gasp. Daniel didn't know what was more terrifying, the fact that he couldn't make his body move anymore, or the sinking feeling that nobody was coming to help him. As Daniel sat there motionless on his bed, he heard the heavy metallic sound of the guard's flashlight knocking on his cell door window. Daniel heard the guard then shout out 2 or 3 commands at him, but his body wouldn't respond, so he just sat there motionless. Then Daniel heard the heavy door slide open, and he heard the sound of the guard's boots walking towards him, and then Daniel saw the guard's face as he stared directly into Daniel's wide-open, unblinking eyes. Daniel watched as the hulking guard reached out and gently touched him on the shoulder. And because Daniel was so rigid and couldn't really move his body, as soon as the guard touched him, it was like he became a rocking chair. He just went back and forth on the bunk, more like a piece of wood than a human body. The guard took one more look into Daniel's eyes, and then a moment later pulled out his radio and called for medical help. Later that day, Dr. Owen Green examined the middle-aged man who now lay shackled to the gurney in the emergency room of the Santa Clara Valley Medical Center. Dr. Green checked his watch and noted that the man, Daniel Martinez, had stared straight ahead without blinking for at least 3 straight minutes, and the rest of his body was motionless too. And not just motionless, but frozen. Dr. Green could barely move the man's legs or arms without applying significant force. Dr. Green wondered if maybe Daniel had been given tranquilizers to keep him docile, so he ordered standard blood tests, and soon enough, he had the results. The tests found no tranquilizers in Daniel's system. Meanwhile, several hours had gone by, and Daniel's frozen state had not changed at all. So the doctor decided to run a few more tests just to make sure Daniel wasn't faking his symptoms to try to get out of jail. Dr. Green picked up the small hammer normally used to tap under a person's kneecap to test their reflexes. But instead of doing that, the doctor turned the hammer over and dragged the pointed side very firmly across the sole of Daniel's left foot. Now, normally, this would elicit a pretty big reaction. It's uncomfortable. But as he did it, Daniel stared straight ahead, giving no reaction. Next, the doctor took Daniel's right hand and dragged the hammer across his fingernails, jamming it into his nail beds. Most people cannot absorb that pain without reacting, but again, Daniel didn't even move. Dr. Green still was not entirely convinced that Daniel wasn't faking this, so he decided to try an extreme test. He asked the nurse to bring him a vial of ammonium carbonate, also known as smelling salts. He broke open the capsule and waved it directly under Daniel's nose. Now, most people, when exposed to smelling salts with it right under your nose, will instantly gasp for oxygen as their nose fills with the most irritating ammonia vapors. But Daniel didn't even cough. At this point, Dr. Green knew Daniel could not be faking his symptoms. Something was clearly very wrong with Daniel, and he needed to be seen by a specialist. A week later, Dr. Kenneth Schuster, the hospital's head of neurology, walked into an exam room to check up on Daniel. As Dr. Schuster entered the room, Daniel lay propped up in bed. He stared straight ahead, his mouth slightly open. His arms were bent and frozen at his sides. Dr. Schuster had been asked to help make sense of Daniel's symptoms. Many other doctors had tried to diagnose Daniel, but so far, nobody had an answer. By this point, Daniel basically could not speak at all, so as a result, it was impossible to get a clear medical history from him. And even though Dr. Schuster could see clear track marks on Daniel's arms, indicating a history of intravenous drug use, he didn't know of any drug, legal or otherwise, that could cause a man to freeze like this. So, the doctors could not agree whether Daniel's problems were from a psychological problem or caused by a physical condition. Now, the staff psychiatrist had diagnosed Daniel with something called catatonia, which is a condition where someone becomes rigid and mute after some sudden psychological crisis. Considering Daniel appeared to abuse drugs and did have a criminal history, it certainly was not out of the question that maybe he had suffered some kind of severe trauma at some point. But Dr. Schuster was not convinced that catatonia was the right diagnosis here. And so he decided to test this theory by testing Daniel for a particular symptom of catatonia, called waxy flexibility, in which patients can remain in uncomfortable positions indefinitely. Dr. Schuster gently pulled one of Daniel's stiff arms until it was straight over his head. Daniel's arm stayed frozen in the air for about 30 seconds until gravity began to pull it softly down. Dr. Schuster nodded as he timed the process. It took at least 3 minutes for the arm to fully come back down to rest. And so at this point, Dr. Schuster understood why the psychiatrist thought that this meant that Daniel was catatonic. But Dr. Schuster decided to perform some other tests that could show Daniel's problems were not purely psychological. He noticed that Daniel hadn't blinked at all since he had entered the room. And so Dr. Schuster tapped Daniel gently between the eyes. Even people with catatonia will eventually blink if they're tapped in this way, and Daniel did blink. However, most people will stop blinking, even if the tapping continues. But Daniel didn't. He just kept on blinking, which Dr. Schuster knew was a sign of brain damage. And then, after a while, Daniel's eyes suddenly slammed shut. Dr. Schuster asked Daniel to open them, and Daniel didn't. He just sat there with his eyes closed. Dr. Schuster was starting to see that Daniel had a problem in the part of his brain that controls movement. This meant that Daniel's frozen condition was likely caused by an injury or disease in his brain, not by psychological damage from a traumatic life event. Dr. Schuster instructed one of his colleagues, Dr. Ryan Curtis, to move Daniel to the neurobiology unit of the medical center for further treatment. But Dr. Schuster wasn't sure what that treatment would even be. As he ran through the lists of other tests he might want Dr. Curtis to perform, Dr. Schuster wondered how they could even help Daniel at this point. A week later, Dr. Curtis spooned some pudding into Daniel's mouth and watched him slowly swallow. Dr. Curtis had been personally helping feed Daniel the last few days, so it was easier for him to monitor his progress. With a week of around-the-clock hospital care, Daniel was better hydrated, and his nutrition had improved. But the fact was, Daniel was still mostly silent, motionless, and frozen. When Dr. Curtis had finished feeding Daniel, he went to wash his hands in the sink. Afterward, as he stood there drying his hands, Dr. Curtis's eye caught a glint of light reflected on Daniel's fingernail. Then, another little flash from another fingernail. Slowly, faintly, Daniel's fingers were moving. Dr. Curtis realized Daniel was intentionally moving his fingers. This was not just a reflex. Dr. Curtis grabbed a pen from his pocket and a pad of paper from the nurse's station. Then he went over to Daniel and put the pen in his hand and began to wrap Daniel's fingers around the pen. And he was shocked when he saw Daniel begin to grip it. Once Daniel had the pen, Dr. Curtis asked Daniel to write his name on the pad. Slowly, Daniel's hand began to move over the page, and at first it just looked like a squiggly mark, but over the next 5 minutes, Daniel was able to slowly write out his name. Dr. Curtis called for Dr. Schuster to come witness Daniel's progress. Over the next half hour, the two doctors watched as Daniel wrote 3 more short lines. Daniel wrote that he was aware that his body was not working, but he didn't know why. Dr. Curtis was thrilled to see that Daniel's mind was working inside of his frozen body. And so as Dr. Curtis made a few notes of his own, Dr. Schuster began asking Daniel questions, and with each answer, he began to piece together a history of Daniel's health. And so Dr. Schuster asked Daniel to tell him what kind of medicine or drugs he was taking. And Daniel wrote one word in big letters: heroin. When he saw this, Dr. Curtis shook his head. He and Dr. Schuster both knew that heroin, as harmful as it was to the human body, couldn't cause the extreme symptoms Daniel was suffering from. So Dr. Schuster rephrased the question. Had Daniel been prescribed any medicine by a doctor? Dr. Curtis then helped Daniel hold the pad steady as Daniel scrawled one more shaky word: no. Over the next few hours, Dr. Curtis and Dr. Schuster put together the rest of Daniel's story. They went over every detail of the night 2 weeks earlier when Daniel's body first began to freeze. They covered the drugs, the hallucinations, everything. And then Daniel wrote down something that stopped both doctors in their tracks. Daniel wrote that his girlfriend, Kathy, had also woken up feeling stiff the same way Daniel had on that terrible morning this all began. But he hadn't seen or heard from Kathy since then. Dr. Schuster immediately rushed to the phone and called the police to request an immediate welfare check at Daniel's address. He could only hope that Kathy was still alive. Several days later, Dr. Schuster pulled into his parking space at the hospital and took the back elevator to the neurobiology unit. It was finally time to give Kathy an examination. When the police had done that welfare check at Daniel's apartment, Kathy had not been there. It would turn out she was staying with her family. However, it took Dr. Schuster making many phone calls to the family to convince them to bring Kathy to the hospital, even though they knew something was wrong with her. But eventually, her sister had finally brought her in, and today, the sister was by Kathy's side as Dr. Schuster entered the room. Immediately, Dr. Schuster could see that Kathy was in the same frozen state as Daniel was. Kathy's sister wiped Kathy's mouth with a cloth as she told the doctor how her sister had come home that morning 2 weeks ago, stumbling and slurring her speech. The family had rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors there had refused to admit her for what they assumed was drug intoxication. Kathy's sister was outraged, but she was afraid that if she made a scene, Kathy might be arrested, so she brought Kathy home. Since then, the entire family had taken care of Kathy around the clock and prayed she would just snap out of this. Dr. Schuster told the women that his best guess as to what was happening to Kathy, which also clearly was happening to Daniel, must have started on the same day, that whatever happened to both of them at the same time. Maybe they accidentally ate something toxic, a pesticide perhaps. Maybe there was a carbon monoxide leak in the furnace, or they had some other chemical exposure in Daniel's apartment. Dr. Schuster said he didn't want to rule anything out at this point. And so in order to figure out this mystery, Dr. Schuster convinced the sister to let him admit Kathy to the hospital. That way, at a minimum, she could get the basic care that she needed. A few days later, Dr. Curtis took the short drive down to Santa Cruz, where a fellow neurologist was throwing a party. Once he got inside, he was happy to see some old friends. But it wasn't long before he and his neurologist friend were back to talking medicine. Dr. Curtis wanted to discuss Daniel and Kathy's strange symptoms, but first, his friend wanted to tell Dr. Curtis about a strange case he was working on. He described 2 patients he had seen in a local emergency room the week before. They were brothers who lived in Watsonville, about 50 miles from San Jose. They were 2 healthy young men in their 20s who had been found in their apartment by their mother. Both men were completely frozen, unable to move or talk. Dr. Curtis couldn't believe what he was hearing. His friend was describing Daniel and Kathy's symptoms exactly. He found himself nodding when his friend said that he thought these 2 brothers had the symptoms of a neurological disease called Parkinson's, which can make muscles rigid and slow-moving. Dr. Curtis had discussed the possibility of Parkinson's with Dr. Schuster, but they both agreed that a Parkinson's diagnosis could not possibly be correct for Daniel and Kathy. Parkinson's develops slowly, and Daniel and Kathy had gotten sick literally overnight. What's more, Parkinson's disease is not contagious, but both Daniel and Kathy fell ill at the exact same time. So diagnosing Daniel and Kathy with Parkinson's, it just didn't make any sense. Dr. Curtis's friend felt the same way about his 2 patients. Then he added an odd detail about these 2 brothers that he found interesting, although he didn't know if it was related to the disease they were suffering from. He said both of the brothers were longtime heroin users. Dr. Curtis knew that Daniel and Kathy were also heroin users, but he'd never heard of heroin making people frozen. But 4 frozen heroin addicts could not be a coincidence. Even though it was very late, he asked his friend for the phone and called Dr. Schuster immediately. After sharing this new information with Dr. Schuster, Dr. Curtis could hear the concern rising in his colleague's voice as he made the link. What if a poisoned batch of heroin was circulating around Northern California and it somehow caused these Parkinson's-like symptoms? If the heroin was to blame, they could have a serious public health disaster on their hands. First, they needed to track down some heroin from the same batch and test it right away. And second, they had to warn heroin users that there could be a deadly poison on the streets. A week later, Dr. Schuster flipped through Daniel Martinez's medical records one more time as he sat on hold with the San Jose Police Crime Lab. As a headache began to settle in between his eyes, he caught a glimpse of his face reflected in the small window of his office. It was late, and he looked as tired as he felt. He hadn't gotten a full night's sleep since Dr. Curtis woke him up last week with the news about the 2 frozen brothers. After the hospital put out a press release about the potentially poisoned drugs, the local media had picked up the story. By the end of the week, Dr. Schuster had found himself in a room full of cameras explaining the situation to reporters from all over the state. As a result of all this coverage, 2 other cases had been discovered, bringing the total number of frozen patients to 6. In between seeing patients and running the clinic, Dr. Schuster had acquired samples of the heroin each of the patients had injected and sent the samples to the crime lab for analysis. Just then, the hold music paused, and Dr. Schuster finally heard the familiar voice of the crime lab's lead toxicologist, Sabrina Davis. As Sabrina read the test results, Dr. Schuster sat up in his chair, completely stunned. She told him all 6 patients had injected the exact same chemical, but that chemical was not heroin. However, she said she wasn't actually sure what this chemical was, and it would take time to figure that out. Dr. Schuster thanked Sabrina for all the hard work and asked her to keep on searching. And he was about to hang up the phone when Sabrina suddenly said she had one more idea. She suggested that he track down an article in an obscure medical journal that reminded her of this case. It described a college student from the 1970s who had been found paralyzed in his parents' basement in Bethesda, Maryland. Dr. Schuster jotted down the name of the journal, thanked Sabrina again, and then hung up the phone. The next day, Dr. Schuster found a copy of the article, and after he finished reading it, he finally understood what was happening to these 6 frozen patients, and the answer had been staring them in the face the whole time. It would turn out Daniel, Kathy, and the 4 other frozen patients had all been poisoned by a bad batch of something that was brand new at the time: synthetic heroin. Synthetic street drugs were so unusual that the drug compounds were written about in medical journals like the one Sabrina suggested to Dr. Schuster. That article described the case of a college student who was trying to cook up fake heroin, a compound called MPPP. When the amateur chemist heated the compound at too high a temperature, the heat changed it into a different compound called MPTP. When he injected this bad batch of fake heroin, he froze up and couldn't move. All the symptoms of advanced Parkinson's disease. Daniel, Kathy, and the rest of the other frozen patients got a batch of the same kind of overheated fake heroin. When they injected it, this faulty chemical wreaked havoc on their brains, causing them to develop the same Parkinson's-like symptoms overnight. People with Parkinson's lose certain brain cells that control the brain's ability to produce a crucial chemical called dopamine. Dopamine delivers the brain's messages to the nervous system, telling the body how to move. Without dopamine, people cannot move at all. Usually, it takes Parkinson's victims years for enough of these cells to die off before they notice a change in their motor functions. But scientists found that the fake heroin chemical, MPTP, was able to destroy these brain cells within a week. While there's no cure for Parkinson's, Daniel and the rest of the patients were thankfully able to be treated. They were given a compound called L-Dopa, a medicine that increases the dopamine in the brain, and after just 1 dose, they were already able to start moving their bodies normally again. However, L-Dopa treatment comes with many side effects, and unfortunately, none of the frozen patients made a total recovery. But there was a silver lining to this case. The discovery of this bad batch of heroin, the MPTP compound, for the first time gave researchers a substance that could reliably create a Parkinson's-like effect in a lab setting. Now, scientists can accurately test for new drugs on animals and get them to market much faster. And so as a result, what happened to these 6 people has led to enormous advances in Parkinson's research. August 9th, 1989, 23-year-old Duncan McPherson pulled his little red car into a parking lot inside of a lush green valley in Vienna, Austria. After parking his car, Duncan reached across his middle console and he grabbed an apple out of a bag, and then he took a bite and just admired the unbelievable landscape all around him. He was near the Austrian Alps, and so there were literally just mountains jutting up everywhere. Duncan, who was originally from Canada, had been this highly touted, unbelievable first-round draft pick by the New York Islanders back in 1984. The Islanders are a professional ice hockey team in the United States. But despite Duncan's incredible promise and athleticism, he just couldn't ever get it together, and so he never actually made the New York Islanders' big league roster. And so, in 1989, Duncan started to realize that maybe his hockey career was coming to an end. But instead of just hanging up his skates in frustration, Duncan decided he would pursue a different type of career that kept him still within the hockey world. He would become a coach. And so, in 1989, Duncan had agreed to coach this small-time professional hockey team in Scotland. And for Duncan, his thought was, I'll go there, I'll learn how to be a good coach, and then down the road, I'll maybe have the opportunity to coach much more prominent and prestigious teams. But before moving to Scotland and beginning this new career, Duncan decided what he really needed right now was just to take a break. Because for basically his whole life, Duncan had been playing hockey around the clock practically 7 days a week. You don't get to become a first-round draft pick unless hockey is your life. And so Duncan thought, you know what, before I begin this huge life transition, I'm gonna just kick back and relax and go on a huge European vacation. And one of the first stops of this vacation was going to be the Austrian Alps right in front of him. However, he wasn't just going to look at these incredible mountains, he was going to snowboard down them. Or more specifically, he was going to learn how to snowboard on these incredible mountains. And so Duncan finished eating his apple and then chucked the core into the bag. And then he hopped out of his car, shut the door, locked it, and then began walking across the parking lot towards the white gondola station. A gondola is like a ski lift, but much bigger. It's kind of like a small bus with lots of windows, and it's connected to a cable, and that cable, which is elevated off the ground, pulls you up and down mountains. Now, typically, people ride gondolas just for the incredible view of the mountain from up high. But some gondolas are actually in place to take people to specific locations in the mountain. And typically these locations are areas that are not accessible otherwise. You need a gondola to get there. And in Duncan's case, the gondola that he was about to hitch a ride on was of the latter variety. It carried passengers from the station near this parking lot high up into the Austrian Alps, up to about 10,000 feet of elevation, where there was another gondola station called the Eisgrot Mountain Station. And right next to the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station was a very unique ski resort called the Stubai Glacier. And overwhelmingly, this ski resort was the reason why people were taking this gondola. This ski resort was unique not only because it was very hard to get to, you basically had to take a gondola or hike up to it, but also because the actual slope that skiers and snowboarders would use at this resort was not just a snowy mountainside like virtually all other ski resorts around the world are. No, instead, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort was a glacier, and so people were literally skiing and snowboarding on a glacier, hence the name. And a glacier, in simple terms, is just a huge swath of thick, permanently frozen ice. And so, in the warmer months, when other ski resorts around the world were not able to continue operations because there was no snow, or it was too warm to make snow, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort did not have that problem. Because, in those warmer months, they could just drive their huge snowcat tractors with their big rakes behind them all over the slope, the glacier, and their rakes would basically chop up the top layer of the ice, turning it into powder for people to ski on, which allowed them to basically stay open every day of the year. And so Duncan, back down in the parking lot, he walked over to the gondola station, he bought his gondola ticket, and then he hitched a ride on the first gondola that swung through the station. And after a slow but beautiful ride up into the mountains, where all that lush greenery down below in the valley was replaced by jagged snow and ice up in the Alps, Duncan finally saw the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort and the glacier itself right behind it that stretched up to the top of the mountain. A few minutes later, the gondola Duncan was on arrived at the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station, and Duncan, along with the others inside of the gondola, hopped off, and then Duncan immediately walked over to the resort and headed into the equipment rental store. And after getting his snowboard and his boots and all the other equipment he would need, he headed right back outside to wait for his instructor to arrive. Duncan had previously purchased a lesson with an instructor at the resort. It was set for 11 a.m. And so Duncan, he's out there at the foot of this glacier, and right at 11, an instructor walks over and introduces himself, and Duncan and the instructor immediately start getting into the basics of snowboarding, how to put your boots into your bindings, how to use the edges of your board. And then for a little while, the instructor and Duncan didn't go up the glacier. Instead, they just kind of worked on some basics on the flat ground right there. And then after the instructor felt like Duncan was ready to go, they both walked over to the tow rope, which is a way to get to the top of the slope. There's a cable that kind of rotates from the top to the bottom of the mountain, and there are all these bars attached to the cable, and skiers and snowboarders grab the bar while standing on their snowboard or their skis, and they literally get pulled up the mountain. And so Duncan and the instructor grabbed onto the tow rope, they made their way to the top of the glacier, and from there they pushed over to the start of the run. And once they were there, the instructor strapped into his snowboard, and then Duncan strapped into his, and then they were off, very slowly making their way, kind of like a falling leaf pattern. Duncan was not just going straight down the mountain, he's a beginner, and so it's very slow, very controlled, and as they went down, the instructor's giving Duncan tips, how to stay more on his edge, how to slow down, how to speed up. And very quickly, the instructor saw that Duncan was so good at balancing, his legs were so strong, likely because he was a professional hockey player. And so the instructor was telling Duncan the whole time they're going down how unbelievably good he was doing for his first lesson. And so finally, after about an hour of very slowly making their way all the way down this glacier, they reached the bottom where they had first been doing some flat ground stuff. And when they got there, it had started to rain. And it was raining bad enough that lots of people on the mountain were abandoning the mountain and running inside of the resort to get out from under the rain. And so the instructor, he looked at his watch and he realized they were almost at 1 p.m., which was the end of their lesson. And he said to Duncan, I don't think we have time to go back up. Plus it's raining. Duncan said he didn't care about the rain, but he also understood that, it wasn't ideal conditions. And so they decided that even though there was a few minutes left, they would just cancel the lesson right there, and they would actually just go inside and grab lunch together. And so they made their way out of the rain into the resort, and when they went inside the resort, the instructor noticed that Duncan's sweater, which was underneath his yellow rain jacket, was totally soaked. And so he offered to Duncan, hey, do you want to take your sweater off and I'll hang it up inside my office? And, by the end of the day, it should be dry. And Duncan thought, great, that's fine. So he took off his wet sweater, he gave it to the instructor, and while the instructor was going to his office, Duncan went into the gift shop and he just bought a new sweater for the day. And after that, Duncan had his new sweater on with his rain jacket over it, and then he met the instructor in the cafeteria, where they both sat down and had a nice meal. They got to know each other a little bit better. After they were done eating, both of them looked out the window and saw the rain had subsided, but in its place was lots of fog that was rolling in, and so very few people were going back onto the mountain. But the instructor told Duncan that, hey, you did so good today that you should really go back out there on your own this afternoon and practice. Do some runs, go nice and slow, same as I was teaching you, and then tomorrow, when we have our follow-up lesson, we can maybe, get into some more advanced things. Duncan thought that was a great idea. He said he would definitely go out there and practice on his own. And then the two men cleaned up, and the instructor made his way to meet his next client, and Duncan headed right outside, grabbed his snowboard, and began walking towards the tow rope. The next morning, Duncan's snowboard instructor arrived a little bit early to work. And so after getting off the gondola, he made his way over to the resort and he grabbed a cup of coffee in the same cafeteria where he and Duncan had eaten the day before. And then after finishing that coffee, the instructor grabbed his snowboard and the rest of his gear and then headed outside to meet Duncan in the meeting spot they had both agreed on. But when it was time for the lesson to start, Duncan didn't show up. And so the instructor for a second thought, was there somewhere else we were going to meet? Did I get the time wrong? But he checked the time and he remembered the conversation he had with Duncan. They were going to meet at the foot of the tow rope and he was right there and Duncan wasn't. And so he thought, okay, maybe Duncan's running late. But he waited and waited and waited and Duncan never showed up. The instructor was bummed because he and Duncan really had kind of become friends the day before and he was looking forward to teaching Duncan some more today. But the instructor knew it was pretty common for tourists to cancel their follow-up snowboard or ski lessons. It's like they show up for that first day, they get really into it, they plan on going the next day, but then other distractions in their vacation pull them elsewhere and they no-show for the lesson. And so the instructor didn't take it personally. He just assumed that, Duncan had found something else to do that was more fun. But the instructor knew he would see Duncan again because Duncan's sweater was still sitting in the instructor's office. 1 week later, Duncan's parents, who were back home in Saskatoon, Canada, got a very unexpected phone call from the Dundee Tigers hockey team, which was the professional hockey team in Scotland that Duncan was going to go coach after this big European vacation. The team rep for this hockey team asked the parents if they knew where their son was because he had not shown up for his first day of work. And Duncan's parents, they immediately were like, that doesn't make any sense. He was so excited about this job. This is a really big deal for him. He would never miss the first day. And so the parents told the team rep that they would try to get in touch with Duncan, and as soon as they did, they'd be in touch with the team, and the team rep said they would do the exact same thing for the parents. However, after this call, the parents quickly realized that trying to get in touch with their son was going to be nearly impossible. They knew Duncan had gone on this big European vacation, but they didn't have his itinerary. They didn't know what countries he was going to, in what order. They really only knew that he was really excited and he was just going to be on vacation. That was kind of it. And remember, this is 1989. They can't just call Duncan. There weren't cell phones. They didn't have the easy modern ways that we all communicate instantly. And so the parents are like, who do we even call? Where do we go? What do we do? And so ultimately, even though this felt kind of dramatic at the time, the parents decided to file a missing person report with Interpol, which is an organization that connects police across international lines. However, the parents quickly learned that this missing person report was not going to become a high priority item for any police anywhere in Europe, because their son was 23, he's healthy, he's strong, he's smart, he's of sound mind, and really all that had happened was Duncan had missed a single day of work on the back end of a huge vacation. So there's lots of reasons why that could have happened. Maybe he extended his vacation. Yeah, it's not professional, but it's totally possible. Or maybe he doesn't want to take the job after all. Or maybe he's just running late. I mean, there's a lot of very logical explanations for why Duncan didn't show up. And so, in short, the parents were told that if you want to find your son right now and not just wait for him to reappear, well, you better go looking yourself. And without hesitation, that's exactly what Duncan's parents did. They packed up a couple of suitcases and they headed to Europe to go find their son. Because to them, it felt like something was wrong here and there was no time to waste. But again, the parents have no idea where their son would have gone in Europe. And so they don't really have a good starting point. They don't know who to talk to, but they just began chasing down every single seemingly insignificant lead they came across. And as they traveled all over Europe, they hung up thousands and thousands of flyers that showed their son's face, said he was missing, and here's a number to call if you know where he is. But despite these efforts, the parents really got nowhere. That is, until about a month into their search, when still they have not found Duncan, they have no idea where he is, they've chased down all these leads, they've all dead-ended, and at this time, the parents convinced several news outlets around Europe to air a segment on their news about Duncan. And one of those missing person segments aired in Austria. And the news anchor in Austria, when they were doing the segment, they described the car that Duncan was almost definitely driving when he went missing. It was that little red car. The parents had discovered in chasing down their leads that their son had borrowed the little red car from a childhood friend who used to play hockey with him, and the friend had told the parents that he had lent it to Duncan, and Duncan had told him he would have it for a week and then return it. But Duncan had never returned the car. And so the anchor in Austria does this segment about how Duncan is missing, and if you have information, come forward. They describe the little red car, and sure enough, not long after this segment aired in Austria, somebody found Duncan's car. It was still sitting in that parking lot right near the Stubai Glacier gondola. Immediately, when Duncan's parents heard about this, they flew to Vienna, Austria, and they met with police who brought them out to look at their son's car. They hadn't moved it. It was still just sitting where he had left it. And then also police showed the parents what they had found inside of the car, which included Duncan's passport, a letter to his girlfriend, where he talked about how excited he was to go to Scotland, and also a bag of rotten fruit. The police also told the parents that now, with the discovery of this vehicle, they were going to really lean into this missing person case to try to find their son, and that the next day they were going to launch this huge search of the area near where his car was to hopefully find Duncan. And so the parents, who were now cautiously optimistic that they might get some answers, they left the police and they went to a local hotel to rest up before the next day when they would be up early and join this huge search party. But when they got to that local hotel, they did what they always did everywhere they went in Europe. They began handing out all these missing person flyers with Duncan's face on them to everybody they saw in the lobby. They began hanging them up all over the hotel. And sure enough, just by completely random chance, they handed one of these flyers to Duncan's snowboard instructor. They handed it to him, he looked at it, and he did a double take, and he was like, I know him. And he explained how he taught Duncan how to snowboard, and then Duncan didn't show up the next day, and he just figured, okay, he blew it off to go do something else, but he'd come back for his sweater, but he never came back for his sweater, and he never heard from Duncan again. And so the parents, they have been searching all of Europe for a month, and they haven't talked to anybody who knew Duncan. They've gotten nowhere, and now they've just randomly stumbled on probably the last person to see Duncan before he went missing. And so they kept asking the instructor, give us more information. What was his attitude like? Was he stressed out? Was he scared? Was he worried about something? Where did he go? Give us anything. But the instructor really didn't have that much more information to offer. And so he tried to answer all their questions, but really just finally said, look, I'm sorry. All I know is after we ate lunch together on the 9th, Duncan said he was going to go out and do some practice runs, but I never actually saw him go up. I didn't see him come down. I just assumed he went up there and was kind of on his own for the day. And then, of course, the next day, I didn't see him and he never came back. And so I'm sorry. That's all I know. And so the parents finally said, thank you so much for the information. Please get in touch with us if you remember anything. And the instructor said he would. And then after that, the parents made their way to their room and they went to bed. The next morning, the parents got up early and they headed to that parking lot where Duncan's car was. And there were all these people, police officers and volunteers that were there to be a part of this big search party. And so after the parents explained to the leaders of the search party what the instructor had told them, that very likely their son had been up at the Stubai Glacier ski resort when he went missing, the entire search party quickly hopped on gondolas and made their way up there. And all day, this search party combed this glacier up and down. They walked all around to the backside of this mountain. They rappelled down cliffs and they hiked all over this entire segment of the mountain, but nobody found anything that gave away where Duncan had gone. And the next day, it was the same story. Huge search party looking everywhere, expanding the search, not just Stubai Glacier, but basically all over this entire swath of mountain range, but still, they found nothing. And so, at the end of the second day, the authorities went up to Duncan's parents and they told them that unfortunately, we can't continue this search. We're calling it off. But Duncan's parents, they didn't call off the search. They continued searching for another 14 years. And over that time frame, they went back to Stubai Glacier over and over and over again. They searched it up and down. They knew all the staff members. They knew all the nooks and crannies of the entire place. But they never found any sign of their son. Fast forward to July of 2003, so 14 years after Duncan had gone missing, and a Stubai Glacier ski resort employee was riding the tow rope towards the top of the mountain when they noticed there was a bright yellow piece of trash right in the middle of the slope. And so the employee rode the tow rope just a little bit higher, and then he let go and skied down to this yellow thing. He reached down and he began pulling on this piece of yellow, and suddenly he stopped. And absolutely horrified, he realized this was not trash. While no one knows for sure what happened to Duncan, here is the leading theory that Duncan's family and authorities, for the most part, agree on. Back on August 9th, 1989, after having lunch with his snowboard instructor, Duncan was feeling motivated to go back out and take some practice runs. And so he headed outside, he looked up at the glacier, there's all this fog rolling in, but it's not raining, and so nobody's on the slope, and so it's perfect for a beginner. He's going to have this place to himself. And so he grabs his board, he makes his way over to the tow rope, he straps in, he grabs onto a bar, and he makes his way to the top. Once he gets off, he makes his way over to the start of the run, he puts his other foot into his binding, he makes sure he's all set, and then he stood up and began slowly kind of waffling his way down the completely vacant and very foggy slope. And as he was going along, he got more and more confident and began going a little bit faster and a little bit faster, until finally he was basically just bombing it down the mountain, relying on his natural balance and strength to kind of keep him up. And then all of a sudden, he caught an edge and flipped forward and smashed into the ground, and when he did, he broke his leg. The unique danger to humans when it comes to glaciers is something called a crevasse. Basically, cracks form in the ice, and sometimes these cracks can be massive, like mind-bogglingly massive, hundreds and hundreds of feet, that if you fall into this thing, you're done. No one's getting you out of there. You are falling either to your death, or you're falling so far down that no one can get to you. Or, like in the case of Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, they had the issue of little crevasses forming kinda all over the place. Especially if it rained, the rain would begin to crack the ice, or if maybe it was warmer than usual, the ice would crack here and there. And so the resort was really good about constantly patrolling their slope to make sure no crevasses had formed anywhere on the slope. And so when you got to Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, you were warned that there is such a thing as a crevasse. This is a real glacier, so make sure you're looking around and don't fall into one. Well, because it had rained, a crevasse had formed, a small one, like a pothole, in the slope, but because it was so foggy because of the rain, as Duncan was bombing down, he didn't see it, and that's what he caught his edge on, causing him to fall and break his leg. And so Duncan, he's now stranded in the middle of the slope. He's not close enough to the bottom to where he could pull himself into the resort. He's not close enough to the top where he could get himself up there and talk to the tow lift operator. And so he's just kind of stranded. There's nobody on the mountain. It's so foggy, nobody can see him from the resort. And so he's just stuck in agonizing pain, wondering what he's supposed to do. At the same time this was happening, another ski resort employee was climbing into one of those big snowcat tractors at the top of the glacier. These tractors were what the resort used to chop the top layer of ice and turn it into snow. And because it had rained that day, a lot of the snow had melted, and so this employee needed to basically go over the entire slope from top to bottom and grind up the ice and make some new snow. And so the employee hopped in the cab of this tractor, shut the door, turned on the engine, turned on the back rake, which in your head, picture a long stretch of metal dragging behind this tractor that had rotating blades that cut into the snow as it moved along. And so this employee, after turning on the rake and making sure everything worked, they drove the snowcat and the rake onto the start of the downward slope, and they began crisscrossing back and forth across the entire slope, turning it all into fresh snow. And as this employee drove, they were very careful not to go too quick because they knew they couldn't see very far with all of the fog. And so they're going like 1 or 2 miles an hour, being very cautious. And then suddenly, at the last second, they see something in the snow. It kind of appeared out of the fog. And so the employees swerved as fast as they could to avoid hitting it. And they did narrowly miss it. Their big tank-like treads that are on these tractors just missed running this thing over. However, the back rake with the rotating blades did not miss this object. It went right over it. The employee immediately parked the snowcat and then leapt outside and ran over to see what this thing was. And when they got there, they could not believe what they saw. It was Duncan, and all those rotating blades that had crossed over him had basically mutilated him. One of his arms had been cut off, one of his legs was nearly cut off, but it's believed Duncan was actually not dead. The injuries were horrible, but they would not necessarily have killed him outright. He would bleed to death without help, but in theory, he could have been saved. But the employee, even though this was a total accident, totally panicked and decided that because it was so foggy, no one must have seen this. No one was around, and so no one would know that they were the ones who ran this guy over. And so instead of helping Duncan, they just tied him up and dragged him behind the snowcat off of the glacier over to this area where this employee knew there was a very deep crevasse. And they chucked Duncan, who might have been alive at this point, into the crevasse along with his arm and his severed leg, and then the employee used the snowcat tractor to rake over the crevasse. They filled it all in and packed it down, and then they drove down the rest of the way and just hoped no one would ever know. But over the course of the next 14 years, the glacier would melt more and more each year until finally Duncan's yellow jacket popped through the ice. And that's what the resort employees saw as they were going up the tow lift and thought it was trash. It was actually Duncan's jacket. They skied over, they tried to pull it out of the snow, only to then see, literally in the ice, Duncan McPherson looking right back up at them. And Duncan still looked like he was 23 years old because he had been frozen this entire time. According to the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, Duncan must have just fallen into this crevasse and died. That's what they say happened, and some authorities say that is what happened. But when they pulled Duncan out of the ice and they found his body had been chopped apart and his snowboard had even been chopped apart, that told a very different story. As for the snowcat driver who drove over Duncan, they were never actually officially identified or charged with any crime because there was a statute of limitations that had run out by 2003. And so no one has ever been held accountable for Duncan's death. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts, and you will find all of them. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you listened to today, but in video format on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. Go check it out.